He's talking about Russia's intent to kill as many people during this winter. Russia's strategy has been not just to increase the attacks against Ukraine since the Istanbul summit last year and kill more civilians, targeting specifically civilian locations as well as energy production facilities. But this winter, the enemy this winter would like to break Ukraine's spirit. And every time Ukrainians came out during the holidays to sing their carols on the street, every time during a blackout, you see Ukrainians gather together, whether it's in their shelters, whether it's going to the points of invincibility. This stands in the direct contrast to what Putin wants to see. He wants to see Ukrainians sad and broken and pressing their government to give up. And this is not what he's seeing. And that's why Keith Kellogg visiting and any American or foreign delegation visiting Ukraine is needed right now to see just how unbreakable Ukraine is. And the one thing that Putin is very worried about is Ukraine surviving this winter and coming back and hitting harder in the spring.
We will talk about the Peace Council created by Trump, what problems this organization can solve and what Ukraine should prepare for. We will discuss this with our guest, Andrij Dobriansky, Director of Communications and Media at the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America. Mr. Dobriansky, nice to see you.
Nice to see you as well. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for joining us. And let's start with the first question. Trump created the Peace Council. How do you assess this initiative by US President?
Not being well received in the United States so far. Obviously, this signing ceremony that happened in Davos, very performative. This is not a treaty that's been negotiated with any governments. So the United States Senate or Congress hasn't looked at it. It will not be ratified by the Senate, so it doesn't have the weight of U.S. law that, say, the UN Charter has or the NATO Charter has in the United States. Those were ratified by the United States Senate, and therefore they are treated just as seriously as U.S. federal law. So this initiative was greeted with confusion, especially at the signing ceremony today, where the leaders assembled were, as one newscaster described it today, not were familiar with even. So this initiative is something that President Trump has proposed, building off of what Steve Witkoff promised to do, which is bring peace to the Middle East. We have yet to see that. I believe that if anything goes forward, this Council of Peace will have to do something in that area before being involved in other conflicts.
What do you think Trump can realistically do in the sector, in the Gaza sector?
Realistically, it's clear that he is not interested in doing the work of diplomacy, which is sending diplomats on the ground to talk to people, to do conflict resolution. The United States used to have dozens of these kind of programs. In fact, I personally know that when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014, the State Department was ready with peace-building efforts if the Minsk process were to go forward and the cessation were to be signed by both sides, developing programs for local businesses, trying to figure out how to start development on the ground locally. This is not something that this administration has even thought of or announced. Those programs were announced months before any kind of potential peace would have been signed in Ukraine. And here we have this process, which was peace process, so-called, which was initiated by Steve Witkoff at the beginning of this administration. And we have yet to see them go forward to the second round of it, including bold statements by members of the Israeli government who say that this peace process isn't theirs. So they're not really quite invested in having it work out the way President Trump wants it to work out.
And can the Peace Council help in the solving problems, solving some questions of Russia-Ukrainian war, some crisis that this war bring to our country, and how exactly could it be?
Well, it would help if some of these countries' leaders actually visited Ukraine to figure out what's happening there. It's one thing to understand what's happening in the Middle East, because many of the signatories today were from Middle East or Muslim-dominated countries who are familiar with the conflict in Israel. However, what's happening in Ukraine, you had somebody like Viktor Orban sign up for the Peace Council, and yet we have yet to see a state visit during the war like many other European leaders have done in solidarity with Ukraine. So I think the more important thing is for the American side, especially those who are in Europe today, in Switzerland, perhaps some of those cabinet members can jump over into Ukraine and understand what exactly the people of Ukraine are living under, the lack of electricity, the lack of heating, the nightly and daily bombardments of civilian locations. These are some things that you cannot understand on a written paper. So when it's President Trump, Vice President Vance, or any other American representative, unless they've been to Ukraine, like former General Keith Kellogg, who I believe is planning to return in the coming weeks to Ukraine, you really don't understand what exactly you're trying to work out. And it's that kind of granular, on-the-ground understanding which is the building blocks of a peace process.
Many countries have joined this peace council, but not democratic European countries. How do you think should Ukraine join?
I think Ukraine has a very good reason not to join, which is that it is a country in a state of war. It does not make sense to be a member of a peace council if you're actively at war. It is not a war of choice. It is a war of defense. It is a war protecting its own people from genocide, a war of liberation of its lands that are occupied. But it is certainly not in a state of peace, as demonstrated by President Zelensky's rhetoric over the course of this war. So that is probably the best argument to lay clear to the Americans. We will join the Peace Council, but after we are at peace. Currently, Ukraine has to focus on defending itself.
Yes, it's exactly the same, I thought. Witkoff is flying to Moscow and then to the United Arab Emirates. A literal meeting with Ukraine, Russia, and the United States is planned. How do you think? Is this a good sign?
Abu Dhabi could be, well, it wouldn't be what happened in Saudi Arabia last year, where Marco Rubio was holding separate talks with both with the Ukrainian representatives and representatives from the enemy state. But this is very similar, in my estimation, to what happened in Istanbul last year, where we originally thought that it was going to be president to president. President Trump really wanted President Zelensky to be in Istanbul and potentially meet with President Putin. That never happened because President Putin didn't even fly to Turkey like President Zelensky did. Then we thought it would be at the level of foreign ministers, and Minister Sabiha was in Turkey, as well as Marco Rubio was in Turkey, but Mr. Lavrov did not fly down to Turkey. And we finally got down to a side where we had two different delegations from Ukraine and the enemy state, but they wouldn't even allow, the Russians wouldn't even allow the Americans to take part in something like that. So for me, what's interesting about what's going to happen in Abu Dhabi is we know who the Americans are sending, we know who the Ukrainians are sending, but how seriously are the Russians taking this if the lead would be somebody like Kirill Dmitriev, who is not a government representative. He's more of a private businessman with ties in business with President Putin. So what are we really getting if he's the lead on a negotiation in Abu Dhabi?
According to, we have already known how has Russia's position changed compared to the Istanbul talks there last year, and can you assess this?
I think the biggest change has been the increase in attacks on Ukraine since Istanbul last year. President Trump often says that this is not my war, this is Biden's war, this happened before me. Well, I agree with President Trump that this is not the same war that we saw in 2022, 2023, and 2024. This is a vastly different war. It is dominated by attacks on civilian infrastructure, on the killing of civilians. There were more civilians killed in 2025 than you have to go all the way back to the first months of the war. They are specifically targeting civilians. They are specifically trying to freeze Ukrainians and have them die in the cold without electricity, without the ability to send messages out. This is what Russia has done since Istanbul. So if there's a definite rhetoric coming out of Russia since then is that we do not care about your peace process, President Trump. We are going to do what we want to do. And at this point, you have not figured out a way to stop us.
Kit Kellogg says Putin is in a difficult situation and is looking for a way to end the war. How weak do you think Putin really is?
I think Putin would very much like to freeze and, sorry to speak so bluntly, kill as many Ukrainians as possible this winter, and in hopes that that breaks the Ukrainian spirit. Because one thing that he would be very worried about is if Ukraine does what it's planning to do, which is survive this winter, survive these attacks, and then come out into the spring where he cannot wage a war of freezing Ukrainians by targeting their infrastructure. President Putin would really like to break Ukraine this winter, and that's why every moment where Ukrainians come out into the street and song during the holiday season, that's why every moment where you see Ukrainians standing in solidarity with each other, helping their fellow Ukrainian to lift up their spirits or helping them with energy or communication, this flies in the face of what Putin is trying to do. And so I believe Putin will fail in his respect, but he is desperate in the fact that he would like to finish Ukraine this winter. And unfortunately, Ukraine is not allowing him to do that.
Kit Kellogg says Ukraine needs to survive the war and then things will get easier. Do you see the hope he is talking about?
He's talking about Russia's intent to kill as many people during this winter. Russia's strategy has been not just to increase the attacks against Ukraine since the Istanbul summit last year and kill more civilians, targeting specifically civilian locations as well as energy production facilities. But this winter, the enemy this winter would like to break Ukraine's spirit. And every time Ukrainians came out during the holidays to sing their carols on the street, every time during a blackout you see Ukrainians gather together, whether it's in their shelters, whether it's going to the points of invincibility, this stands in the direct contrast to what Putin wants to see. He wants to see Ukrainians sad and broken and pressing their government to give up. And this is not what he's seeing. And that's why Keith Kellogg visiting and any American or foreign delegation visiting Ukraine is needed right now to see just how unbreakable Ukraine is. And the one thing that Putin is very worried about is Ukraine surviving this winter and coming back and hitting harder in the spring.
So let's talk about the Trump's term and 1 year of President Trump in office. So what achievements do you see for him?
Well, President Trump came out on Tuesday with a full list of papers about what he has accomplished. Unfortunately, this has been the least accomplished Congress and presidency as far as long-lasting legislation. President Trump, instead of looking at the leadership possibilities of the presidency and implementing them into law so they last for many years after him, has instead focused on individual agreements with his administration and private universities, his administration and businesses, whether they're in the United States or foreign businesses, a private deal between him and another government. This is not multilateral diplomacy, and this is not something that will stand the test of time. But this is the strategy that he has sought. So once again, Congress has set a record for the least amount of laws and legislation passed by a Congress in the modern era. The same with President Trump. However, he has also set a record with the number of presidential orders he has signed, trying to do something directly from his own pen as opposed to gathering members of Congress and Senate to pass a law. So this fundamental dissonance means that he is able to work faster in terms of enacting change, ordering immigration agents to round up people very quickly, sometimes against people's constitutional right. But after the fact, there is no long-standing precedent because none of this has been put into law or decided by a court whether it's legal or not.
And what should Trump expect? How do you think in the next elections? Is he preparing for them? And what is the mood among Americans?
Well, Trump would very much not like to see that the opposition party, the Democratic Party, wins in November of this year. It is right now the popular rating shows that President Trump is historically unpopular, and bodes well for the chances of the Democratic Party to gain a majority both in the House of Representatives and the Senate. One of the things that President Trump is most scared of is another impeachment process. I don't know if an impeachment would happen right away with him, but it's very clear that several members of administration in the cabinet, such as the Homeland Security Secretary who ordered all these immigration raids, she might be impeached. The Attorney General of the United States, because of her collusion with working with all these immigration raids, she might be impeached as well. But in the end, whether Trump is focused enough on them, it doesn't seem that he cares that his actions and his words diminish the rating of Republicans. It doesn't matter to him that the kind of things he's proposing actually hurt Republican incumbents, people who are already in office, who have to defend the idea of possibly buying Greenland. Where would these monies come from? Increasing the budget of the military in the United States to $1.5 trillion. Again, where do these monies come from? At the same time as we're lowering taxes, so we're getting less money into the federal budget. There's a lot of things that he set up for a potential loss, not to mention that he's also supporting more radical candidates than those who are currently in office to see if they can win against a Democratic opponent. So there's a lot of things in the negative for President Trump. The question is how he will react to that, and will he react in the way he did in 2020 and claim that these elections were stolen?
Mr. Dobriansky, I thank you for this conversation, and I'd like to ask our viewers, please press the button like under this video, leave a comment, tell us where you're watching us from. I remind you, Andrij Dobriansky, Director of Communications and Media at the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America, was the guest of this stream. Thank you.